I want to tell you about an incident that you probably have not heard about. It was an ugly one on the streets of New York last week. Here was the scene in Brooklyn. A mob of Jewish men chasing, kicking, and screaming at a young woman who they apparently thought was Arab and a pro-Palestinian protester. It's still unclear if she was either. She had to cover her face with a scarf to protect herself as they chanted in Hebrew, "Death to Arabs," among other violent slurs. Police had to escort her away while physically restraining the mob. The Council on American Islamic Relations is now demanding hate crime charges against those attackers. But aside from that, no big updates. The story has gotten little media attention. Just imagine for a moment if it were a group of Arab or Muslim Americans chanting "death to Jews" or "death to Israel." If something awful like that happened, how quickly would there be calls for congressional investigations or hate crimes charges or condemnations from politicians? When Dutch and Israeli soccer fans fought in Amsterdam, it was an international incident that led the news for days. When Israeli restaurants are vandalized or attacked, the media shows up and the politicians quickly condemn it and show solidarity, as they rightly should. But it's an old and exhausted and predictable double standard. The insignificance of Arab and Muslim and especially Palestinian life is far too common in our society, plain and simple. And this reality doesn't just lead to alleged hate crimes in the streets. It follows or allows for our political class to be indifferent or accept or even support the destruction of Palestinian life and the starvation of the Palestinians in Gaza, and the occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank as well. Joining me now to discuss this double standard is Mohammed Al-Kurd. He is the author of Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal. Mohammed, it's good to have you on the show. I know that you've been covering and writing about this double standard for quite a while. Talk to us about this concept of perfect victims and where that comes from.
Thank you, Ayman. Thank you for having me. I think for many Palestinians, if not all of us, we encounter the demand to be polite in our suffering from a very young age. What I mean by this is that we are under occupation. We have been for decades facing Zionist aggression, genocide, whether incremental or full-blown, like we're seeing today in Gaza. And despite all of this, what is on trial is our characters, is how we respond to the aggression and the brutality that is waged against us. The world tells us that we must demonstrate our worthiness of grief before we are grievable. We must demonstrate our worthiness of humanity before we are treated as human beings. And the standard for us to be, grievable victims or acceptable victims is a racist standard, it's a dehumanizing standard, and necessarily it is an ethnocentric standard that is designed but through Western civility and through Western value points.
This weekend, Mohammed, I'm sure you saw Philippe Lazzarini of UNRWA stated that Gaza's children are starving. The government of Israel continues to block the entry of food and other basic supplies. A man-made and politically motivated starvation, nearly 2 months of siege, calls to bring in supplies are being unheeded. And we've seen and read horrible stories of death by starvation, yet this isn't new. It has been happening for 18 months. It is still being allowed to happen. How do you process this, and how do you explain how this has been allowed to happen for so long? How the dehumanization and the vilification of innocent people in Gaza has now become normalized and accepted?
The fact that the Israeli regime is using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza today is only happening through the diplomatic and military cover of the United States and other Western countries, like Germany, for example, through the suppression of anti-genocide and anti-war protests in these countries, and it's happening because of Western racism towards Palestinians who have been largely, characterized and identified as Muslims. And we understand that the Islamophobia that is rampant in this country that goes most of the time unaddressed. Meanwhile, we hear about fabricated charges of anti-Semitism launched against student protesters left and right, suppressing them, censoring them. And it's a bit ironic to hear about students who say that they feel unsafe because of protests in their campuses. Meanwhile, there's not one university in the Gaza Strip that has been left unbombed by the Israeli military. And they're not just bombing hospitals and schools. They're going inside the hospitals and shooting machines, blowing up, life-saving machinery. This is obviously a calculated genocide, and it's obviously politically motivated, and it's in the best interest of the United States, because this administration, and much like the other administrations, are interested in the destruction of the Palestinian people, in the destruction of the resistance of the Palestinian people. And Trump has been a lot more explicit than previous presidents in their plans to forcibly expel Palestinians from Gaza.
We've seen, Mohammed, with Gaza getting more attention, that people are not focused on what is happening in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Just a few weeks ago, a Palestinian-American teen from the West Bank was shot and killed by Israelis, yet no one knows his name or his story in this country. Our political class in the United States barely says a word about it. And again, there is this double standard when, even when a Palestinian-American, whether it's a journalist or a teenager, is killed, that we don't hear the same kind of resounding condemnation from our officials.
I think there's, a misconception that because the media doesn't cover it, the political class is ignorant or is uninformed about what's happening. But the truth of the matter is, these Congress people and these senators are not ignorant. They know exactly and precisely what's happening, the kinds of brutalities waged against the Palestinian people, and they are simply okay with it. And when we're talking about mainstream media companies obfuscating the truth, removing the killer from the headline, or writing about our murdered children in the passive voice, they're not, slipping up or making errors at their job. They're making editorial decisions to obfuscate the occupation, to obfuscate the Zionist genocide against the Palestinians, because it is, in the interests of the ruling class, which control these mainstream, papers, to keep the occupation, to sustain the genocide.
Things are obviously extremely grim right now, as we talked about what has happened in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. People who are protesting it are now literally here in the United States being abducted off the streets, sent to prison. It's a grim situation, but is there anything that is giving you hope right now? Is there anything that you see that says this may be a crack in at least the way the public perception is, or public sentiment, that may translate into some kind of political change, or perhaps a lack of continuous support for what is happening on the ground, both in Gaza and the West Bank?
I think what's happening in the streets is absolutely horrific and scary to a certain degree, and I don't want to downplay the losses and the pain of being separated from your family, like in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, and the coldness of the prison, and the fact that there are tens of thousands of people are in ICE detention for political reasons or for otherwise. But I think I believe in optimism as a political obligation, and I think this rampant crackdown, this absolutely cruel crackdown on protesters, on advocates of the Palestinian cause, indicates that the United States government is very aware that anti-Zionism is becoming a national sentiment, is becoming a public sentiment in this country. And they are recognizing the massive, unprecedented shift in public opinion. Polls support this. Just talking to random strangers on the bus support this theory that there is a public shift in opinion, that people support a free Palestine and people oppose Zionism. And the kind of crackdown that happened from universities and from the administration and from public and cultural institutions indicates that all of these organizations are invested and interested in keeping the status quo as is, the status quo being the dehumanization of Palestinians. But I believe that things are changing for the better, that people are waking up. And now the challenge for us is to transform this public sentiment into action, into sizable action.
Really quickly, Mohammed, are you worried about your own safety?
Yeah, just a little bit. I've been getting threats here and there, and obviously I'm a public person, and I have been very clear about where I stand on things. But I think none of these threats compare to being under under rockets and under bombs. So I think it's really important for us in this moment not to fear the threat.